start. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. All three engines up and burning.
You are listening to
1.
The Astrocast. Welcome back to the Astrocast. I'm your host, Rue. Today is Tuesday, May 28th, 2024. We are slowly watching the full moon disappear. We're sitting at about, I think, 75% today in a waning gibbous phase. And we are finally past the last full moon until my dark sky trip, which is coming up in approximately 13 days now. So it's finally right around the corner. I've been looking forward to this, as I'm sure all of you know, if you've been listening to the show at all, for probably 6 months now. So very, very excited. I finally got to the spot where I can start looking at early forecasts. I try not to count forecasts too much when they're, 14 days or more out, because anything can happen, particularly with beach weather. But it seems like decent weather forecasts initially, nothing like rain all day long. It just says an isolated thunderstorm, which is typical where we're going, but hopefully we won't get too many. So we'll be heading out pretty soon, 13 days. So like I say, right around the corner, and I am quite excited about that. I've been testing all of my gear as of late because anytime you go on a trip somewhere where you're hours away from your house, it is a very good idea to test all of your gear before you go. Know what your possible points of failure are. And then ideally, if you're like me, you bring a box with a bunch of backup cords and connectors and extra Allen head screwdrivers and just everything you could need, really, in case something inevitably goes wrong, because it will. What you don't want to happen is to, spend all this time and energy setting up a specific type of rig only to get all the way out to your dark sky site and find out that you're missing, one crucial piece. I'll give you an example. I'm working on getting my Canon mirrorless camera set up for Milky Way shots because I want to do Milky Way panoramas this year while I'm out there. That's kind of high on my list for things to do. And I've ordered a few adapters that I needed after watching a whole bunch of different videos online for the best method for exactly what I was looking to do. And I got everything from Amazon, of all places, today, because it was mostly ball heads and rotators, something I didn't necessarily need to go to an astronomy store for, but I got it all in. And the one thing that wasn't right, everything fit together perfectly. It's all really good, high quality stuff. But the L bracket of all things, it's a bracket that you can attach directly to your mirrorless camera. So you can slide it in to like a ball head or, anything with a Arca Swiss connection, which is the typical type of connector that you see on DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. And go figure, the screw that you twist in that has the little dealie on the back that you can pull up and move it back and forth so you can get your camera set in the perfect area. It's the one that's twist into the Arca Swiss plate and then inevitably twist into the back of your camera. It's the wrong size. So they sent me an L bracket that looks perfectly fine, but the Arca Swiss screw is not fitting, so it won't slide up and down. And at the lowest level position, my camera is too big to fit in there. So that is a great example of, I'm glad I tested this before I got 8 hours away from my house, because I won't have another screw like that. So I tested all my other Arca Swiss screws, hoping one of those would do the trick, but go figure, of course they won't. So I'm going to end up returning that and buying a higher quality L bracket. They're not an expensive, piece of kit at all. You should be able to get one for like $15, but apparently the $15 ones run the risk of getting terribly machined screws that don't fit or just the outright wrong size. So glad that I went with another one. I went with a Sunway Photo. They appear to be a pretty popular photography company that makes lots of cool accessories and tripods and gimbals and everything. So I'm hoping I'll have better luck with that one, which will be here in a couple of days. So I probably owe you guys a little bit of an explanation. I did take last week off, and if you are an every week listener of the show, I greatly appreciate it. I just needed a week off. I had a whole lot going on at my job. I'm working crazy hours during my day job right now because we are working towards the end of a big project that we've been working on for over a year. And I was just exhausted. So I just needed a week off. Please keep in mind, this is a one-man show. I produce, record, distribute. I do the whole 9 yards. So, every now and then I will be taking a day off. My plan when we're on our trip, because I will be away on Tuesday night of that week. I do plan on doing an episode that week, absolutely, but it'll probably come out on Friday instead of the normal Tuesday. So that'll be whatever the week of the 9th and the 10th is of June. Not next week, but the week after, because again, we're going on our dark sky trip. So I will be out looking at the Milky Way instead of releasing podcasts. So very, very excited about that. I'll certainly be sharing all the photos that I get. I've already got quite a few targets picked out. I'm bringing my large 80 millimeter telescope with the ASI 294 MC Pro. So that's going to be my kind of deep field, if you will. I mean, it's only 448 millimeters, but that's as deep as I'm going to go. I've got the 585. Actually, it's the 585 MC Pro that's hooked up to that, not the 294. And that's got a more cropped view than my 294. So the 294 is actually a lot wider sensor. And the 585, because it's a more cropped sensor, it actually gives me a closer up view than my 294. So I was looking at, I think Iris Nebula is actually going to be an excellent target for that one. So I'm definitely thinking Iris Nebula. And with my wide field rig, the one that I talked about a few episodes back about the ultimate wide field rig, that one is going to be pointed at Rho Ophiuchi for sure. I would definitely like to get a really, really good shot of that. And I'm still debating how I'm going to do this. I might use a 50 millimeter lens to get the Blue Horsehead Nebula and Rho together in one shot with my Canon camera. I haven't decided yet. But I've got my Sky Guider. I do have just a regular Ride Ascension Star Tracker, Sky Guider Pro. I've got that, and that's what I ordered all those parts for. And I've got that kitted out now to be able to do really nice panoramas that you can stitch together of the Milky Way. So initially I was just going to get 14 millimeter wide field shots of the Milky Way and call it a day. And I'm still planning on doing that. I've got a Rokinon 14 millimeter f2.8 lens. It's kind of I'm not going to say the gold standard because it's not that high quality of a lens, but it's a very accomplished astrophotography lens that's very popular because it's so inexpensive for how great of a lens it is with minimal coma in the corners. But that is not the kind of lens that you want to use for something like stitching together Milky Way photos because it's so wide. I was worried that I would get distortion in the corners, and then when you try to stitch it together, it's just going to look weird. So I'm still debating on the focal length that I want to go with. I'm thinking 50 millimeters would be an awesome spot to go. I actually have a local camera shop in Charlotte here called Cardinal Camera, and I've worked with the owner up there in the past. They're really cool, and he runs specials and stuff. I've actually bought several pieces of gear from him over the years, but he offered to rent me the Canon RF 50 millimeter prime, the 1.2, I believe it is, the really expensive $2,500 lens. So I could rent that for a few nights from him and then put that on my Sky Guider with a really good polar alignment, obviously. And then I could use that to stitch together Milky Way photographs. So this is something that is new to me, stitching together Milky Way stuff. So I've, ever since I got into astrophotography, I have pretty much stuck to what you would consider, deep space astrophotography. Even though I do a lot of wide field stuff, I haven't done a whole lot of Milky Way stuff. And I'm really, really excited about the potential of doing that. And it is very different from deep space, at least from what I'm seeing so far in terms of, how you go about taking the shots and your framing, and you want to have an interesting foreground object. And you really do have to think in a much different way when you're working at focal lengths that are, so much wider, 16 millimeters, 24 millimeters. 50 is like, honestly, it's more on the telephoto side for a Milky Way shot. And when I say telephoto, that generally means like a more zoomed in lens. Although you wouldn't consider a 50 millimeter a telephoto lens by any means in regular photography. If we're talking deep space, you're kind of getting into that zoomed in enough range to where you'll start picking out individual nebula much easier. Whereas something like a 14 millimeter lens like my Rokinon, it is really, really wide. So you can capture, the whole of the core of the Milky Way and a whole lot of constellations to the left and right of it as it's coming up. So it challenges you differently. And that's just something that I haven't done yet. So I thought it would be a lot of fun to give it a try because we'll certainly have, dark enough skies out there. And I was looking at my data from last year when we went on this same trip, and I was super new to Milky Way photography back then. That's kind of the last time I really did it, except for a couple of times. I've taken a few shots, just single images down at the observatory, but, I'm not talking about those necessarily, because with these, I'm trying to stack the images to bring out more detail. So if you could picture like a situation where you've got, let's just say for our purposes, a 24 millimeter lens, because a 50 is just so much more zoomed in. And like I say, I haven't made my mind up on what direction I'm going to go in yet. But let's say you had a 24 millimeter lens and it took up, the vast majority of the, core of the Milky Way, and then a lot of it going up into the sky. You could, take 3 or 4 shots from left to right at your horizon, and then move your camera up and take 3 or 4 shots from right to left, back the other way, and then move it up again and rinse and repeat. But while you're doing that on, each of those placements, you take, let's say 6 15-second shots, and 15 seconds would be a lot if you weren't using a star tracker, but I will be at 24 millimeters, 15 seconds. I think you're pushing the threshold of getting star trails if you were to go that long. I don't know. There's a rule that you can actually use for star trails. It's the 500 rule for full frame cameras, and then it's the 300 rule for crop cameras. So the reason you would want to use that 500 rule would be if you were taking a wide field shot and you didn't have a star tracker, you would want to be able to take the longest exposure that you can without seeing any trailing in your stars. And it's a very simple formula. It's just basically 500 over your focal length. So if it's a 24 millimeter lens, for example, and you're using a full frame camera, you would take 500 and then divide that by 24. And the answer, which is 25 seconds, let's see, 500 divided by 20. Well, that's if you're at 20 millimeters. Yeah, well, if you're at 20 millimeters, it's 25 seconds. I honestly, though, for me at 24 millimeters, I'm thinking like 15 seconds. So, and then if you're using a crop sensor camera, since crop sensors have a, narrower field of view, they're kind of more zoomed in, if you will. Not really, they're not, but the sensor is cropped, so it appears that way in your image. Then you would use the 300 rule. So take, 300 and then divide it by your focal length, and you would get 12 and a half seconds. So easy formula to remember, just 500 over your focal length if it's a full frame, and then 300 over your focal length if it is a crop sensor. But I won't have to worry about that because, like I said earlier, I'm going to be using a SkyGuider Pro, so I can take longer exposures. So my hope is to get like a really good polar alignment, and then maybe 30 to 60 second exposures is what I'd like to do, and do depending on how many shots I have to take, somewhere like between 3 to 6 photos of each individual area. And as the night goes on, the Milky Way will get higher, and obviously you can get different points of view depending on where the Milky Way is situated in the area. So this is still really early in the year for Milky Way season. If you were to do the same exercise around August, then your Milky Way, earlier in the night would already be up right overhead in the middle of the sky. I guess technically it's not really that early for Milky Way season because it's already been out for several months, but it's starting to come out early enough, at night before midnight. Now it's starting to rise in the east if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. And, I get to take advantage of that. So very much looking forward to that. So speaking of polar alignment, so I mentioned polar alignment on the SkyGuider Pro, and I was thinking to myself the other night, whenever I was getting started with astrophotography, one of the hardest things for me to grasp when I was brand new to the subject was polar alignment. Because I went online and obviously I knew the phrase polar alignment, but people used too much jargon when they were trying to describe what polar alignment was. They would say, like, put your mount in the 0 position and yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, what the hell is the 0 position? I didn't know what they were talking about. So I thought I would take a few minutes today just to discuss with you what a polar alignment is, why we do it as astronomers and astrophotographers, and why it is so crucial to your photography if you're taking photos of the Milky Way or nebula. And if you get even further in at really long focal lengths, like 1,000 plus for galaxies, or even higher, then polar alignment becomes much more important. You have to be very, very precise the longer your focal length. If you are at a very wide angle, like 16 millimeters, then you could probably get away with just a decent polar alignment. I've even had people say that they just, adjust their star tracker to the proper latitude, and then they just kind of point it to where they think true north is, or not think, where their compass says true north is, or the app that they're using, and then that works good enough for them. But with that being said, it's a good idea to know how to do a good polar alignment. So first of all, why do we do a polar alignment? Obviously, the Earth rotates as we are sitting on it. And because the Earth rotates, the stars appear to move overhead as we see every night. They rise in the east and then they fall in the west. And we watch this go on, but there is one star that just happens to be in a particular spot in the sky. It is actually called Polaris, the North Star. It is referred to as the North Star because it is the closest star to true north, and that is what astronomers use because it never appears to move in the sky. And this is really important because it gives us a fixed location that we can point our telescopes to. And then once we are properly locked on to the correct area around Polaris, then our right ascension axis on our telescope, so the one that moves along with the star's movement, we can move that around wherever we want, and it's still going to follow the same path of right ascension. So that way, even if you're all the way up in the northwest sky with your telescope or all the way in the southeast sky with your telescope, you still have it pointed at the same true north direction. So when that axis is rotating, it's going to rotate at the exact same speed, if you will. And that's very important. Now, Polaris does actually move in the sky. It does do a tiny little circle, and you can kind of see this yourself if you either look through a telescope, with a long-ish focal length. You can watch it do it throughout the night. But an easier way to do it is to open up an app like Stellarium, which is really good planetarium software that I talk about all the time on the show. And I love it so much because it's free and it's excellent. It's open source. There's a ton of great plugins. If for some reason, God forbid, you don't have Stellarium on your computer or your phone for that matter, please do yourself a favor and download it because it has so many great useful tools in it that you'll be very, very happy that you found it. So anyway, so in the southern hemisphere, they actually also have a polar star that they point to. And that star is, Sigma Octantis, or Polaris Australis for the southern hemisphere. And that's part of the Southern Cross constellation, if you've ever heard of the Southern Cross. And it's the same process down there. They have to point their scopes due south at the correct trajectory in order to follow right ascension for the stars. So in order to do this, though, though, in the actual real world with our telescopes, we need to do a couple of things. So assuming that you have an equatorial mount or a star tracker, there are many ways that you can do this. If you've got a device like an ASI Air, or if you're using an app like Nina on your home computer, then they have built-in polar alignment apps that you can use. If you're using a simpler device like the star tracker that I was talking about earlier, which is the Sky Guider Pro, many of them, including the Sky Watcher 2i, I believe, and the Star Adventure GTI for that matter, which is another, I consider an equatorial mount, but depending on the US, they might say star tracker. But since it tracks in both right ascension and declination, I consider it to be a full equatorial go-to mount, but we're not here to talk about that. They have built-in polar scopes, and a lot of equatorial mounts, a lot of them will have built-in polar scopes as well. Sometimes it's an add-on that you can get. Celestron is known for having add-on polar scopes. Ioptron also sells an add-on polar scope that you can get. But you really generally don't need to buy one of those. If you're using an ASI Air, the app works great with your existing telescope. You can use that to polar align. And basically what you're going to do is open up let's open up your tripod first before I jump ahead to the app. You're going to open up your tripod and you want to get it level. So getting it level is important. It's not like crucially important though. I hear a lot of people say like that they'll get their bubble level out or straight level every time that they set up their tripod. I don't personally do that. I get it roughly level and that's good enough. If you're using auto guiding, it shouldn't matter at all if it's just fairly level. Now the exception there, if you're using something without auto guiding, like the star tracker that I'm going to be using, then you would be very smart to take your time in making sure that it is very level, because if it's not, then your polar alignment can be off, even though it appears to be on, because you could be at a sloped angle. So depending on your setup, you can kind of feel this out over time. I would say if it's your first time setting it up, I would definitely take my time and make sure that it's level. And if you're using auto guiding, you should be able to feel it out over a few weeks as to, how much you need to do to ensure that everything is correct. So after we do that, we will go ahead and obviously set our equatorial mount on top of the tripod. And depending on, what kind of mount you have, you likely set it on top of a screw of some sort that twists into the bottom of it. And like my Ioptron CM26 has two azimuth bolts that you bolt down on the side, and then you can move the azimuth bolts back and forth to move left and right when polar aligning. And then star trackers are sometimes simpler, like my Sky Guider Pro just sits on a 3/8 inch bolt on top of a tripod. And it's good to go. So get that set up. And then, depending on, like I say, what kind of device you're using, the next steps can vary a little bit, but really you're going to use the same method either way. So what I would do if I'm setting up my equatorial mount, so I'm going to take my tripod out. I am going to point it roughly north. So if you don't know where north is, just take your phone out, open up a compass app, or if you have Sky Safari on your phone for iOS or Android, you can use that to find north, or many other like apps like Stellarium and what have you. But a compass app will do for this point. Find north. You can actually set your tripod or your phone on top of your tripod and then move it until you have it perfectly north. If you press your phone against a flat surface on the mount, for example, that's a good way to do it. If it's already nighttime out, what I do sometimes is I will just eyeball Polaris. So I'll get right behind my telescope or my camera lens, and I'll kind of get low so I can look up at Polaris in the north sky, and I will try to center it up as good as I can right under or right above my telescope. And then you need to adjust your bolt to determine what latitude that you're at. So this is generally your altitude. You have altitude and azimuth adjustments that you can make on an equatorial mount. Altitude is basically your up and down. So it's going to be, depending on where you're at, you should have a way to either twist a screw, or my CEM26 has like knobs on both sides that you can turn. And basically it'll allow you to adjust the angle of the mount up or down. And you're going to want to look up what your latitude is. If you're not sure, you can just Google it. Here in Charlotte, I'm at about 35.22 degrees. So I just twist that altitude bolt until the little arrow on the side is right at about 35 degrees. That is not exact by any means, but that's okay. Just get it close. And like I say, you can use Polaris as a visual guide to get it centered left and right at least. But go ahead and, get it to where it looks like it's, roughly at the right angle. If for some reason your equatorial mount doesn't have numbers on the side, that's okay too. You don't really need them because you're going to use the polar scope, but this is just for getting it roughly aligned. So after you've got it at about the right angle for where you are, and like I say, you can eyeball 35 degrees or whatever your correct latitude is, then you can adjust the azimuth bolts, and those are the ones that are generally underneath the back of the mount. So if you're facing the mount, generally they're going to be at the bottom of your equatorial mount, and there'll be a bolt or a twisty knob of some kind on the left and the right side of the mount, and then you can adjust those by loosening up on one side and then twisting the other. And then you'll notice, like on my mounts, if I twist the left bolt, then the mount moves to the left, and if I push the right bolt, it moves to the right. So that's how I remember mine. And then for the altitude knob, I actually remember it by up and away. So when I twist the knob away from me, it moves up. So I always just think of up and away, like a superhero, I guess. And that's how I memorized them. You can use whatever sort of mnemonic device helps you. But when you do this over and over again, it does get easier. The first couple times I did it, I was super confused, but now it takes me 5 minutes to do. And that's whether I have an ASI error or if I'm manually doing. Honestly, I can manually polar align faster than I can with an ASI error now, because it's just not that hard to do once you know what you're doing. But anyway, if you figured out how your altitude and your azimuth knobs work, so you can move it up and down, left and right now, what you were going to do, if we'll go with the lower end side, first of all, just like a built-in polar scope. So for something like a Skyguider Pro, which is what I have, or a Star Adventurer 2i, they should both have, or a Star Adventurer GTI for that matter, the more popular equatorial mount, they have built-in polar scopes. So what you can do is actually look through the mount. There should be an actual, like a tiny little telescope lens that goes through the mount. And depending on your mount, you might have to remove something from the back. Like for my Skyguider, for example, where it bolts on to the right ascension, where I can actually like connect to my camera, you have to remove that piece to show the eye hole for the polar scope. And then for my Star Adventure 2i, I believe you have to twist the right ascension. So you have to actually move it to the left, and you can see there's a hole in the middle of the bar, the counterweight bar, when you turn it, that makes it to where you can see through it. So just check and see if there's any obstructions to your polar scope, and if there are, then you may need to manually clear those by rotating something or what have you. But after you can see through the polar scope, they'll usually have an illuminated reticle. Some of the older models, like the 2i, for example, they just had a little thing that you put in and press a button and it lights up. But most of the newer models have a built-in illuminated reticle, and that is very, very nice to have. So when you turn on the equatorial mount, when you power it on, you should have the ability to turn a light on in the polar scope. And, depending on what your device is, the way you do that will vary. With my Skyguider Pro, there's actually a button on the front of the device that I can hold down for a few seconds to adjust or decrease the brightness of the polar scope. And another tip, particularly if you have the Skyguider Pro, I noticed that when you twist the clutch for the right ascension, which is what lets you loosen it up so you can move your right ascension back and forth to balance your scope, it'll actually rotate the polar scope. And technically that doesn't matter if you put it on the right place on the face of the clock. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, and I'll back up in a sec, but it technically doesn't matter if that polar scope is rotated. But if you're new to this, it's a good idea to have those numbers in the correct place. And I'm just telling you that because the first time I turned my Skyguider Pro polar alignment scope on, I was confused because the clock was like on its side, and I'm like, this doesn't look right. All you need to do is actually reach behind where the clutch is, and you can rotate it manually until the scope or polar scope is set up correctly, and you will see a clock face on the inside of it. And obviously you want 12 o'clock at the top and 6 o'clock at the bottom, just like a regular clock would look. So the idea here, what we're trying to do is we want to find Polaris in the night sky. We want to locate it in the polar scope, and then we want to position it on the right part of the clock. So depending on what time of day it is, because like I say, Polaris does make tiny little circles, you have to put it in a particular region of the polar clock. Now it's really easy to find where this is depending on what time of day you are. There are lots of apps. I just use, what's it called here? Polar Clock for Android, and then they also have a free one for iOS that I used to use. But anyway, you just open it up and it will show you basically a picture of the same reticle that you're seeing through the polar scope. But on the picture on your app, you'll notice there will be a cross on one point on the clock. So like right now, for instance, at 8:30, I'm looking at it and it's about the, let's see, 108 position, I suppose you could say, if you were looking at it. And that's exactly where you want to put Polaris on your polar scope clock on the inside of your scope. And now the way you do this is, you might have guessed by now, by using those same bolts that we were twisting back and forth earlier, the azimuth bolts and the altitude bolt. And if you got it to 35 degrees, if you're at 35 degrees like I am, or adjust it to wherever you are locally, and then you lined up Polaris right above the telescope like I said to do with the alt and az bolts, then you should be fairly close to it. If you look through the scope and you don't see Polaris, then you're going to want to, obviously look out of your scope, look up to the sky, and then make small adjustments on the azimuth and the altitude until it comes into view. What I usually will do is I find it's pretty easy where I am to get the up and down right. It's the left and right part that I always have a little bit of an issue with. So I'll start by just moving my polar scope, a little bit to the right and then back, and then a little bit to the left and then back. And then, Polaris is so bright that it should show up very clearly in your little polar scope. It'll be much brighter, than any of the other stars, because it doesn't have any, really bright stars in its immediate vicinity. So it should be pretty easy to spot. So what you're going to do though, is you're going to make small adjustments on those azimuth bolts and the altitude bolts until you get it to exactly where it should be on that little clock face. So like, if I was outside polar aligning right now, I would want to get it to right about 1:08 p.m. or AM on the polar clock. So right on the face there, that's where I want to be. And like I say, that area will vary depending on what time of year it is and what time of night it is that you're out, because it's making those little circles, but that's the idea. So the advantage of using something like an ASI Air though, or Nina, basically any, computerized version of polar alignment, is that it will actually do what's called a plate solve. So it'll determine exactly what part of the sky you are looking at in the app. And then it will tell you exactly how far left, for example, if you need to move your scope to the left, and exactly how far up you need to move it. So if you had Polaris and you were trying to polar align and it was, I don't know, let's say that it was far off to the left and a little bit above where your scope is, then if you were in the ASI Air and you opened up the polar alignment app, what it would likely say is that you need to, move your scope 3 hours to the left and then 1 hour up. And what you can do in ASI Air is there's actually a refresh button that you can press, and it'll keep refreshing the photo every, 2-3 seconds, whatever you set it as. You can make this adjustment if you're first out and it's not dark yet and you're kind of waiting for Polaris to show up. Set it to a really short exposure, so when the stars finally start coming through, you'll be able to see them faster, because if you have it on a 2-second exposure, it's just going to be blown out. But if it's nighttime, you can set it to a 2-second exposure and you should be good. And it'll keep refreshing, and it will tell you how much closer or further away you are to getting to where you need to be. And I like doing it with the ASI Air. Like I say, I've done it with Nina before as well, and they have what's called I believe it's called a 3-star drift alignment. That's supposedly very, very accurate. So you could also use that. It's a little bit of a different method. I will tell you a big advantage too that the ASI Air has. Nina has it as well, but my ASI Air is what I use right now, so that's why I say a big advantage that the ASI Air has is you can, if you don't have a clear view of the North Star or the Southern Cross, if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, there is actually, if you go into the advanced settings under the polar alignment menu, there is a secondary method that you can turn on for polar alignment, and it'll let you actually move your camera. So like, let's say that Polaris is blocked by a tree right in my field of vision. But if I look off to the east, I have a big clearing of sky, right? So maybe let's say 15 or 20 degrees to the east, I've got a really good clearing. What I could do is use the ASI Air app to slew my declination far over, so left and right basically, to that clear open piece of sky over there. And then I could run the polar alignment method and it'll do the exact same thing. It basically plate solves. It sees, where your camera is looking and that point of the sky, and then it knows because of where it's pointing that you need to adjust your altitude and azimuth screws X amount to get it to the perfect area. And with ASI Air specifically, there's a little smiley face. Basically, it'll look sad if you are way far off. You want to, at a minimum, you want to get it to the smiley face, which is depending on your scope. For me, it's like usually within, I think, 4 minutes, I want to say 4 arc minutes, will get you a happy face. And me personally, I like to get it much lower than that. Like I try to aim for under 20 arc seconds whenever I'm polar aligning. And like I say, it really depends on what your focal length is. If you're using a much shorter focal length, like my 135, for example, that I could probably get away with closer to like a minute on the polar alignment and have really no problems. But when you get further in on your focal lengths, like if let's say you're using a 600 millimeter or a 1000 millimeter scope that is zoomed in much further, then you need to be much more precise about your polar alignment, because if you're not, what'll happen is when you go to take a long exposure, like let's say you're taking 3-minute exposures of a nebula, your stars will appear to be egg-shaped because your polar alignment is a little bit off. They trail just a little bit. And if you're really far off, like if you really botch it and you're like, 3 hours off where it needs to be, then your stars might have really long trails in them. And that's something that it does happen frequently with brand new beginners. And I think the reason why is because we tend to use a lot of jargon when we're explaining how to do polar alignment. I hope that was pretty clear and I didn't use too much jargon. Hopefully I taught you altitude and azimuth. Altitude meaning, your latitude, that's your up and down movement on your equatorial mount. And then azimuth is basically your east and west for all intents and purposes. So if you want to move your mount west or east, then you adjust your azimuth brackets. And when you do that, like I say, you just are trying to line up Polaris to get it to the exact right area on your polar scope. You can use a built-in polar scope if it's a star tracker. If you have something like an ASI Air or a Nina computer or laptop, then you can use polar alignment software, which will do the same thing, but a little bit easier because it takes the photos and plate solves them for you. So you do not have to look through a polar scope. You can just look at your screen and it'll say, move it a little to the left, move it a little bit up. So that's basically how you do a polar alignment. Just in case anybody didn't know how to do it, I wanted to give a good tutorial on it because I would have loved to have had one when I was first starting out. Polaris is a pretty cool star. It's the brightest star in its constellation, which is Ursa Minor. Ursa Major being the Big Dipper, if you will, or the Big Bear. But Ursa Minor is where Polaris resides. And there's actually some pretty cool stuff about Polaris. I believe it's, I think it's the 48th or 49th brightest star in the sky. Let me check real quick. It's actually 50th. So I thought it was 48 or 49, but it's the 50th brightest star. But that is not what makes Polaris special. A lot of people assume the North Star when they're growing up must be the brightest star because you just hear about it so much in pop culture. And a lot of people obviously know that for centuries, people have used it to navigate the seas. For honestly thousands of years, we've been navigating the seas using Polaris because the ancient folks certainly knew that it was fixed in position because they very much studied the skies because they had perfectly beautiful dark skies to look at. So why wouldn't they? But some other cool stuff. It's actually a Cepheid variable, which is a star that is routinely varying in brightness over time. And Cepheid variables is actually how Henrietta Leavitt found out distances in space. And she used them to actually calculate the standard candle that is still used today, which we use to determine exactly how far away a given object is in space. I've actually talked about her on the show before. She is one of the rock star original OG female astronomers, if you will. And another cool thing about Polaris is it is not a single star system. It is not a binary star system, which is when you have two stars in one system, but is actually a triple star system. So there are 3 stars in Polaris's direct vicinity that are all in the same solar system. You have Polaris A, Polaris AB, and then Polaris B. Obviously Polaris A is way brighter than the others, but I do believe you can split it, which is a term that visual astronomers will use for being able to visually resolve a pair in a binary star system to be able to see both of the stars at one time. Is called splitting a double. You don't hear that term as much these days because, astrophotography is as big as it is. And, obviously it's booming, but a ton of people still very much enjoy visual astronomy. And one of the coolest things that you can do if you've got a visual scope is go out one night and try to split doubles. I remember when I first got my Newtonian scope, my first Astrophile 130 Celestron telescope, the first time that I was able to split a double, I was so thrilled because it was just amazing to be able to resolve both of those stars at the same time, starting with a really wide eyepiece and then kind of slowly zooming in. I want to say it was a 10 millimeter lens that I used to actually split the double. I can't even remember which star it is now. I wish I would have written it down. You know what? Maybe I did. Let me check. Okay, so I actually do remember which star it was now. It was 61 Cygni, which is a very, very popular and easy to split double star in the constellation of Cygnus. Cygnus is actually a summer constellation, and Cygnus is a swan and one of my favorite constellations for sure. And if you want to, in your ASI Air, for example, you could look up 61 Cygni and you would be able to have a look at it and see if you can split it. I think you could even do it with a good pair of binoculars because you have a magnitude 5.2 and then its partner is magnitude 6. So they're both very easily resolvable with a small telescope, or like I say, even a good pair of binoculars can do it. And when I say that visual astronomers have been splitting stars for a long time, I really do mean that because less than 10 years after Galileo, made the first telescope, he actually had a friend named Benedetto Castelli who discovered that Mizar, which is a very bright star in the night sky, actually had a companion named Mizar B that actually is of nearly equal brightness. So that's been going on for as long as the telescope has been around, pretty much splitting doubles. So if you ever feel like you want to shake things up, or maybe you just want to do some visual astronomy, because believe me, it's very fun, particularly if you have some great dark skies to look from, then try splitting doubles one night. It's a lot of fun. You can find an easy list of them online. If you just Google, easy doubles to split, double stars to split in the, spring or summer or whatever, season you happen to be looking at, you can easily find a list. But I was able to split 61 Cygni in Cygnus, and I remember just being so thrilled when I was able to do that. So polar alignment's going to be pretty important for me. That being said, so I'm going to be running, I guess, 3 rigs, and I may run a 4th camera. I haven't really decided yet. I do remember last time being very busy with just 2 rigs, and this time I'm adding a 3rd. So I'm thinking I'm going to go probably just 3 and leave my other camera at home because I don't want to bring all of my gear with me. I do, but I don't need to bring all of my gear with me. So I'll be running the 80 millimeter telescope, which has an ASI Air, my Star Adventure GTI wide field rig, which is the Rokinon 135 f2 lens. That'll be pointed at several different targets throughout the night, but that one has the f2 filter on it. But I don't think I'm going to be running any filters because we're going to be in pretty much Bortle 1 skies. So why not go full RGB with no filters, except for a UV IR cut filter. I will be running those on the 80 millimeter, and I'll probably test with and without on the 135 just to see what comes out better. But then the Milky Way shots are going to be on the Skyguider Pro. And I mentioned earlier that I had ordered a couple of parts for it because I want to be able to take these mosaics. And the problem that I kept running into was, like, I was thinking I could use the ASI Air because it does have a mosaic mode. But if I'm going to be doing really wide field mosaics, then that's not going to work too well because your right ascension is going to be moving and then your camera is going to get tilted. And once your camera gets tilted, then the mosaic's not going to line up properly and you'll end up with something that's not quite right. So I needed something that I would be able to level constantly throughout the night as the right ascension moved. And I was kind of surprised to find that there weren't any really great affordable options for this particular problem. I did find one really, frankly, expensive option, but I mean, that doesn't surprise me with astrophotography. I think it was called a Genie 2, if I'm not mistaken. And it's basically a motorized, I guess you could say like motorized ball head almost. It can move the camera up, down, left, right, automatically, and you can actually set up a process in the app that connects to your phone to do panorama photos. So it'll know that you're doing like a 30% overlay, for example, because you want to have overlay between each of the photos so you can stitch them together carefully. And I just couldn't spend that much money, like $400+ I believe it was for one of those, because I felt like I was so close to what I needed because I was going to be using a star tracker. So what I was able to do was actually buy a really good ball head, and then I got a device that will let me connect directly to the ball head with something that I can twist 360 degrees. So basically I can pan left and right with it. And then on top of that sits basically an altitude adjustment piece. And I'll post a photo of this in the show notes so you can see exactly what I mean. But essentially what it does is it isolates each part that you need to adjust throughout the night. So the bottom ball head is what it has it's got a level built into it. And I basically need to keep that perfectly level all night because I want the horizon for my shot that I'm taking to be at a level state. So when I stitch the photos together, I have a base level horizon that I can use to stitch together. And then I need to be able to move the camera left and right and up and down. And you would think to yourself, well, why not just use a ball head because you can move it up, left, and down and right with that. But the problem is once you unlock a ball head, it kind of just flops down, and it would be difficult to constantly line it up to this same exact purpose driven level that it was at before, just eyeballing it. So what I did was I bought basically 2 different pieces. So one that I can loosen up and move it left and right to pan, 360 degrees if I wanted. And then another device that I can loosen up and move up and down. So that way I can level out the ball head, and then I can pan a little bit to the right. And then if I need to, I can adjust up and down. So, if I do a second row of shots higher up on the horizon, I can adjust that. And this allows me to adjust all 3 of those independently. So I can make sure that they're all staying, in the same exact field of rotation, if you will, throughout the night while I'm doing it. And I want to actually give a shout out to the guy I found on YouTube that taught me how to do this. All right, sorry about that. I had to look that up. His name is John Rudder. He's actually a smaller channel on YouTube, and he made this video 2 years ago. But if you happen to be listening, John, thank you so much for your video. It was very handy. I sent you a like and a subscription to your channel as well. And if you guys are interested in doing the kind of tracked Milky Way shots that I've been talking about, you can go watch this video online, and he gives a parts list, but unfortunately all the links are dead at this point. But if you're interested, I can I'll post the parts list in the show notes, because I ended up ordering all of them. And that way, if you have something like a Sky Guider or a 2i star tracker, and you want to do some panoramic Milky Way shots, to spend a few bucks to get those adapters that you need, and then you'll be able to do exactly that. So the one caveat that I would say for doing a good tracked Milky Way shot is that you do really, really want to have dark skies. I was testing out a couple of my newer lenses the other day. I was outside at around 4:30 in the morning. I got up super early on a work day, and I just wanted to see, how X lens looked. I haven't even tested the Rokinon 14 yet. I got to do that soon. But anyway, I was able to pick up some of the Milky Way from my Bortle 6 Borderline 7 front yard. But unfortunately, it just doesn't look great. So really, you want like Bortle 5 or lower. I would say 4 if you can do it, to get decent Milky Way shots. And obviously there are filters that you can use to, get rid of light pollution, but there's no substitute for dark skies, as we always say as astrophotographers. And that certainly is the case when it comes to the Milky Way, because it's just such a delicately light thing to see in the sky that, long exposure photography obviously brings out a lot more than you would otherwise get. But if you're in a heavily light polluted area, it's still going to be difficult to pick it up. So unless you want to spend a whole lot more money getting your camera astro modified, if you're using a mirrorless camera like I am for these particular shots, or you can get a clip-in filter. There are several companies that make really good clip-in filters for Canons and Nikons and even Sonys and pretty much all the cameras that are popular that will help eliminate a lot of that light pollution. But again, for me, no substitute other than dark skies. So the darker the better, and that's what I will be doing. So for a recommendation this week, I've got a pretty cool one for you. It's not going to be an astronomy specific recommendation, but I would like to point it out to you nonetheless. As you guys probably know, I'm a big Stephen King fan, and he recently came out with a new collection of short stories, and it is called You Like It Darker. And I've already read, I think, 4 of the short stories so far in the last week, and they are really good. I will say a couple are better than others so far, but the good ones are really good. So if you're a King fan, I would highly recommend checking it out. He actually revisits several of, as he often is known to do, several areas and characters from his books in the past. I won't do any spoilers for that, but if you're a big King reader and you've read many of his books like I have, then you will run into some areas and characters that you know and love from old books that are making a return. So definitely give that a look. It, like I say, it just came out last week. I picked it up on Audible. Very, very excellent audiobook. King loves to use a guy named Will Patton to do his audiobooks. He's been using him for quite some time because I've heard many books that he's narrated, and the guy does just a bang up job doing voices. Really enjoy Will Patton as a voice actor. So if you like audiobooks, give that one a listen. If you like regular books, give it a read, and you will not be disappointed. We actually got our 3rd Patreon member this week, which I am quite happy to announce. Of course, we're still small and growing, but I absolutely love seeing anyone giving back to the show. So I just want to give a quick shout out to our Patreon members. That would be Wiley, David, and Carrie. Thank you guys so much for contributing to help the show. I am officially getting the hosting every month for the podcast paid for now, thanks to you guys. So I greatly appreciate that. If you would like to contribute to helping support the Astrocast feel free to donate at patreon.com/the Astrocast. We have a $1 and a $5 level if you want to give a hand and help the show out. So I think that's going to pretty much do it for us this week. Let me check something. Yeah. We're right almost butting up on an hour now. I want to thank you guys again so much for letting me take the week off, as it were, and just want to warn you ahead of time. You know, like I said earlier, in a couple of weeks, the show will be delayed by a few days. But that's just because your buddy is out enjoying really dark skies, which I certainly hope that you'll get the chance to as well over the summer. If you haven't yet, plan to make a dark sky trip at some point over the Milky Way season. You know, it's officially upon us. If you're willing to stay up late and you're out somewhere dark, you can get an awesome view of it right now. So head to lightpollutionmap.info and find your nearest dark sky. So that is going to do it for us this week. I am your host, Rue. You have been listening to the Astrocast. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and we will be back next week. Clear skies.